Chapter 7. Shiva and I. In the early 30s, at considerable expense, Nana had sat for a portrait with the island's best photographer, who had found Nana a difficult man to please and had charged him accordingly. The photographer finally settled upon, showing Nana in a patriarchal pose with a piercing gaze, had been matched to a large and expensive frame and hung in the living room in a dominant position. Entering that room from any direction, and one had to pass through it to go anywhere in the house, one immediately was confronted by Nana's stare. The eyes seemed to follow us wherever we walked, as though Nana's spirit was looking out of them to observe what went on after his death in the house he had built with that money from the unknown source. I was afraid to look at those eyes. They haunted me. I felt the same way about Shiva, the god I feared the most and therefore worshipped the most in order to appease him. But there was no appeasing Nana's spirit. It continued to frighten us with wild running or stomping footsteps, a disagreeable odor that accompanied them and lingered on, and objects that would be thrown out of cupboards or shoved from tables, sometimes before our wondering eyes. In spite of my efforts to appease Shiva, I had a growing sense of his displeasure. Try as I might with mantras and ritual and worship, I could find no peace in my relationship with this fearsome god known as the Destroyer. Often in deep meditation, I found myself in another world alone with Shiva, and his manner was always threatening. As I ran through my Aunt Sumintra's yard one day, a nail had pierced my bare foot. Lying in bed, feverish with the infection, I had not been able to shake the distinct impression that Shiva had placed the large nail there and guided my foot onto it. I tried to dismiss that feeling as mere superstition, but when I mentioned it to my cousin Krishna, a knowing look came into his eyes. He shared with me that he too had the same impression that Shiva was attacking him. One night, while studying late, he had been slapped by an invisible hand so hard that it had knocked him down, and the next morning the marks were still on his face for us all to see. Another night, invisible hands had chalked him on his bed, and again he had felt that it was Shiva. I had experienced several other attacks that I felt were from Shiva, but neither Krishna nor I could understand why these things were happening to us. Gosina was no help. He didn't like to talk about such things, and I knew why. These mysterious physical attacks and the continued haunting of the house by Nana's spirit had a cumulative, unnerving effect upon all of us. Beneath the surface, there was a tension that could not help but affect personal relationships. This was especially the case with myself and Aunt Ravati. Although we had once been so close, we could hardly get along at all anymore, and sometimes even quarreled in the middle of a family puja. My mother had been in India now for about 6 years, and I was tired of being treated like one of my aunt's children. With a round face and hearty laugh, she was a changeable person, given to extreme moods, feeding her children sweets one moment and spanking them the next. At times, I suspected that underneath the buoyant personality that attracted a steady stream of friends to her house, she was a very unhappy person, and with good reason. After all, she had suffered at the hands of her estranged husband. I speculated that in her last life she had been a man and a wife-beater, and now in this life karma had repaid her with the same fate. Aunt Ravati had been the religious leader in the household when I was younger, but now there were two of us claiming spiritual authority. This created increasing tension between us, and I suspected that more than a little jealousy had developed as I grew older. The long hours she spent each day in the prayer room doing her puja, in meditation, and in worshiping the sun and the cow were more than enough to cause her to fall behind in her household responsibilities. This made her feel harassed, and she often took her irritability uton the restofus, especially on me. In turn, I resented her attempts to involve me in household chores that were beneath my lofty calling. It was not fitting for me to take time from my religious observances for menial duties that others could perform. The only thing I willingly did was graze the cow. Caring for this holiest of creatures was beneficial to one's karma, but since it had attacked me, I had lost my enthusiasm even for that job. My cow worship, too, had stopped. It troubled me deeply to see how the state of blissful peace I had reached in meditation could so easily be destroyed by a scolding from my aunt accusing me of laziness or of failing to do my fair share around the house. Normally a peaceful person, at such times my temper would flare and I would use harsh language in defending myself. Occasion ally, I almost suspected that Nana's angry spirit took temporary possession of me. There were times when I acted just like him, beating one of the concrete pillars supporting the veranda with the long, whip-like branch of a lash plant, until I stood exhausted, staring at the crisscross pattern I had made on the whitewashed cement, wondering what had got 10 into me. Once I grabbed Nana's old leather strap, which he had so often beaten the family with, and lashed it repeatedly across the backs of several of my younger girl cousins, then retreated in confusion and shame. The scene was so poignantly reminiscent of Nana's wild rages. After such episodes, the eyes in Nana's portrait seemed to laugh at me if I made the mistake of glancing at them, as though they knew some secret. I would shudder and quickly turn away, but the memory stayed with me. Surely he was haunting us, not only by the sound of his footsteps, but through me as well. Why should I, the most religious one in the household, be the vehicle for his spirit to continue to abuse members of the family long after his death? It was a question I couldn't face because it seemed to involve everything I believed in. Trying to forget these incidents, I lived for the religious ceremonies, public ones in the temple or private ones in our own home or those of others, where friends and relatives would crowd in. There I would be the center of attention, admired by all. I loved to move through the audience, sprinkling holy water on worshippers or marking foreheads with the sacred white sandalwood paste, or gathering the offering until the brass plate I carried was piled high with blue, red, and green banknotes of different denominations, looking like a huge bouquet of money blooms. Best of all, I loved to sit next to the altar and beside the officiating pundit, the object of admiring eyes. How I enjoyed, too, the deep fragrance of the floral garlands hanging around my neck on these occasions, and the worshippers after the ceremony bowing low before me to leave their offerings at my feet. Although the peace I experienced in meditation so easily deserted me, the occult forces that my ice of yoga cultivated and aroused lingered on and began to manifest themselves in public. Knowing that without these displays of the supernatural my following could never be very great, I welcomed this growing spiritual power. Often those who bowed before me would sense a brightness and experience an inner illumination when I touched them on the forehead and bestow all of my blessing. I was only 13, but already I was administering the Shakti Pat famous among gurus, a true mark of the authenticity of my calling. Shakti is one of the names given to Kali, Shiva's murderous, blood-drinking consort, the mother goddess of power who dispenses the primal force flowing at the heart of the universe. How it excited me to become a channel of her power. Often while I was in deep meditation, the gods became visible and talked with me. At times I seemed to be transported by astral projection to distant planets or to worlds in other dimensions. It would be years before I would learn that such experiences were being duplicated in laboratories under the watchful eyes of parapsychologists through the use of hypnosis and LSD. In my yogic trances, most often I would be alone with Shiva the Destroyer, sitting fearfully at his feet, the huge cobra coiled about his neck staring at me, hissing and darting out its tongue threateningly. Sometimes I wondered why none of the gods I ever encountered seemed kind and gentle and loving. But at least they seemed real. I had no doubt of that, and not mere myths like the Christian god Santa Claus. What a happy day it was for me when my uncle Dayan Areen, Nana's eldest son, returned at last from England, having graduated with honors from London University. When Uncle Kumar had moved to London a few months earlier, Aunt Ravati's matriarchal and authoritarian grip on the Josue hold had tightened. Now, with Dayan Areen's return, we would have a man at the head of the family again. Dayan Areen had been the nearest thing to a real father I had ever known. Perhaps his return would encourage my mother to return too. She still wrote every 2 or 3 months, but there was no more mention of coming back next year. One day shortly after his return, Uncle Dayan Areen took me quietly aside. "I've just bought a new car, Rabbi, and I want you to bless it," he said earnestly. "I won't drive it anywhere without your blessing." I beamed. And to think I had been afraid that he would come back from London having abandoned Hinduism. Dayan Areen had shown little interest in religion for years, but now he seemed to be a strong Hindu at last. "Just wait a moment," I said, trying to use proper English. "I'm going to get some things. I'll be right back." I gave that car a thorough blessing, chasing every evil spirit away and calling down the protection of the most powerful gods upon it. Uncle Dionorine even paid me a hand, some fee, although I protested that it wasn't necessary. In the end, I consented, not wishing to rob him of the great benefit that accrues to those giving gifts to Brahmins. "You've got to go on to high school, Rabbi," Dionorine insisted one morning when he and I were visiting with Ma. I was about to graduate from the school in Mahabir village and had been talking about going back to the temple at Durga, or perhaps even to the large one in Port of Spain. "Rabbi, you've got to have a higher education," he continued earnestly, while Ma nodded her head emphatically. "I mean university, too. It's important for communicating ideas. No matter how enlightened you are yourself, how can you be a good teacher unless you can explain things clearly to others? As well as a thorough knowledge of the Vedas, you need a general education, too." "Well, I'm sure you're right," I conceded reluctantly, hanging my head in disappointment. I had been looking forward to being done with the agony of school, but there was no denying the logic of what he said. I decided to take the entrance exam for the same high school that my cousin Krishna was attending in the south. I could live with Uncle Ramchand, whom I greatly respected. His house was near the school. "Rabbi is coming! Rabbi is coming!" It was Dadi's voice, announcing my arrival from a distance as always. Small suitcase in one hand and sweating from the heat and humidity, I was trudging up from the bus depot to the house of Ramchand Maharaj, my father's older brother, in the southern part of the island. I enjoyed my periodic visits there. His wife, Dadi, was a very outgoing and excitable person and always welcomed me with happy shrieks as soon as she saw me in the distance. But this time I detected a note of alarm in her voice and soon discovered why. As I entered the house, my nostrils were immediately assailed by the distressing odor of goat curry. I had never suspected that they ate meat. What a shocking disillusionment. "Oh, we didn't know you was coming here today." Uncle Ramchand seemed to be groping for words to hide his embarrassment. "I wanted to give you all a surprise," I replied quietly, not knowing which way to direct my eyes, feeling his distress keenly. Oh, the shame. A Brahmin eating meat, and such a good and religious one. My uncle tried to engage me in general conversation about Ma's health and news of other family members, but I answered coldly, making no attempt to hide my displeasure. At last the conversation died. Knowing what I was thinking, Uncle Ramchand tried to justify himself. "You know why Christians does eat meat, Rabbi?" he asked. It seemed a strange question to me. What did it matter what excuses Christians gave for their crimes against my God, the cow? I shook my head, feeling almost too nauseated to speak. How I wished I hadn't decided to give them the pleasure of a surprise visit. God let a big sheet down from the sky full up with all kinds of animals. "Where you get that from?" I asked. "Yeah, man, it in the Bible, the Christian book." "You mean you does read that?" "I don't read it myself, but I does hear about it." "And what happened to the big sheet now?" I was becoming more angry and disillusioned. This was the same book Nana had thrown Ma down the stairs for reading. The book of Christians, the cow eaters. And this was my father's brother. It had all kinds of animals in it. And you know what God tell Peter? He tell him to kill and eat as much as he like. His face wore a look of triumph, as though he had demonstrated full justification for that horrible smell of violence and death in the house. "Maybe," I said sharply, "but he didn't tell you." "But we do it in the name of Kali," Ramchand added. "The temple priests does kill 16 goat every morning at the famous Kali temple in Calcutta." My aunt was nodding her head from just inside the kitchen where she had taken refuge from my wrath. "But the Brahmins don't eat them," I reminded him sternly. I wouldn't touch anything from their table all that day. The very odor of meat had polluted the entire house. People respected me for the principles I held and for the fact that I stuck with them. At home, I had my own plate and utensils, even my own pillow slip and sheets, and no one else dared to use them. I wouldn't eat bread or cake that had egg in it. Ramchand knew this. Always in the past, we had had so much to talk happily together about. Now we sat in an uncomfortable silence, broken infrequently by a few awkward sentences. My aunt stayed out of sight, and so did my young cousins. At last, my uncle suggested that we take a walk to the nearby harbor to look at a large Dutch oil tanker that had just come in the day before. I agreed, glad to have an excuse to get out of the house and away from its defiling odor. The Dutch ship was a beauty, sleek and long and larger than any tanker I had ever seen. One could almost see it sinking deeper into the water as those huge pipes poured a steady stream of black gold from the barges that shuttled back and forth to where she lay just offshore. Near us on the wharf, a cargo vessel was being loaded. Long booms pointed out over the dock, winches screaming as heavy loads were hoisted into the air. Busy stevedores, stripped to the waist, were sweating profusely in the relentless sun. I had always loved visiting the harbor. The bustling activity sent a surge of excitement through me, and the strange names on the ships seemed a tantalizing call to visit faraway, exotic places. Ramchand loved the harbor as much as I did. Without our noticing it, the tension between us gradually eased, and we fell into a comfortable conversation about my plans to attend the nearby high school in the fall, which would make it possible for me to visit him more often. He seemed pleased and assured me that I was making the right decision, one that my father would have approved. "But how come it ain't have nobody working on this boat?" I asked, as we passed under the towering hulk of a freighter that appeared to be deserted. "That really strange," replied my uncle thoughtfully, searching the ship with his eyes. "Look at this," I exclaimed, grabbing a heavy rope that hung down within a few feet of the dock from a jutting boom. One tested it with my weight. It seemed strong enough to hold several tons. "Look how I could do it, just like Tarzan," I yelled, taking a quick run and leaping into the air. Back and forth I went in a giant arc, clinging to the swinging rope, arching high above the dock, then swooping down past my uncle, who was laughing and enjoying the fun. Then it hap-penned. At the top of the arc, as abruptly as if someone had cut it with a knife, the rope suddenly came loose from the boom high above me. "Look out, Rabbi!" I heard my uncle shout almost before I realized what was happening. Down I came, horrified to see that I was heading straight for the narrow opening between the ship and the dock. My flailing hands caught the edge of the wharf, where I hung precariously, half-stunned. Grabbing me by one arm, Ramchand hauled me to safety just as the ship lurched with the slow motion of the water and slammed against the dock. "Boy, you ain't play you lucky, nah!" he exclaimed. I could have been crushed. His lips were trembling and the color had drained from his face. I was almost too weak to stand. We both stared dumbfounded at that serpentine coil of loose rope on the wharf, then up at the boom high over our heads. There seemed to be no explanation. The rope had been secure one instant and the next it was not, as though some unseen hand had suddenly untied it. An involuntary shiver ran up my spine as a flood of memories swept over me. Of the time I had felt unseen hands shove me off a moving truck and I had been seriously injured. Of that unforgettable afternoon when something unseen had held my foot down so that I couldn't pull it from the path of a heavy roller that had crushed it. And other similar accidents. Now, in the shadow of the strangely deserted ship, I felt distinctly the menacing presence of Shiva that I knew so well. Had he untied that rope? I tried to reject the blasphemous thought, fearful of Shiva's wrath, but that sense of his presence lingered on. Why? I was not the meat-eater. Sobered and solemn, we walked slowly back to the house in silence, both of us lost in thought. If this was my karma from a past life, then I felt it was terribly unjust. Why should I be punished for some past sin that I couldn't even remember?